My name is Christina Hawkins, and my self-designed concentration is political and economic affairs in Latin America. And as what I feel the perfect culmination to an end of this undergraduate degree is a semester-long capstone project on ALBA, la Alternativa Bolivariana para las Américas. Bueno, entonces, ¿hay hispanohablantes en este cuarto aquí? José, por favor, díganos, ¿qué significa la palabra ALBA? En inglés.
Daybreak?
Daybreak? Sí. Dawn. Daybreak. I asked him what does the word ALBA itself mean? It is an acronym for the title you see before you, but it means dawn or daybreak in English. And arguably, ALBA is the dawn or the daybreak of a new era of trade policy within Latin America. And it is a direct alternative to the traditional free trade model led by the United States. So with that being said, before I get into too much of a definition for what ALBA is, I would like for this man, you see on your left, Robert Roveda, from the Vice Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Venezuela, to explain in his own words what he believes ALBA to be. Excellent. Okay. Guess that link is not working. Well, anyway, most of you wouldn't have understood it anyway, but basically what he's saying in Spanish, this is an interview I conducted with him in March of this year. I had the incredible opportunity of going to Venezuela on an educational delegation. It's an opportunity for North Americans to see the truth about this Bolivarian revolution going on in Venezuela right now with President Hugo Chavez. And the first things that came out of his mouth were, it's an alternative. That is how Venezuelans and pro-ALBA supporters see this, as an alternative, because the tradition has always been for the United States to create and operate and maintain a free trade agreement, such as NAFTA, which we'll be getting into shortly. And he also emphasized the importance of human beings within this trade alternative, that being the focus of this socialist-driven alternative as opposed to profit maximization. And with that said, I define it in three ways because I am taking an interdisciplinary approach. From a political perspective, the most recent declarations of ALBA call for a political institution, an overarching political institution where each state maintains its own state sovereignty, yet there's a harmonization of political ideology as well as macroeconomic policies. So from an economical perspective, it calls for redistributive economic policies. So for example, in Venezuela, since 1976, the oil company has been nationalized, meaning it's a state-owned enterprise, meaning that it's operated by state workers, and all the wealth is redistributed to the people equally, thus calling on the egalitarian values founded by Simón Bolívar, which you can guess is taken from the Bolivarianism ideology. And these egalitarian values purported a vision of an equal, competent, independent yet sovereign region of Latin America. So, given that definition, I'd like to next get into my textual analysis as one of my methodologies. How I went about this was looking at the text of ALBA and all the declarations that have been put out ever since the first in 2004, when it was first signed between Fidel Castro, ex-comandante of Cuba, now superseded by his brother Raúl, still a member of ALBA though, and Hugo Chavez in 2004. And initially this started out as a barter proposal, because the initial exchange of goods and services was Cuba sending its doctors, members of its nationally run medical sector, in exchange for Venezuela's oil, its very precious commodity and money maker, at very below market prices. So it's not, in essence, competition, it's an exchange of complementarity. They're complementing each other's strengths and weaknesses. They're not competing, as you would see in a free trade agreement with prices. Also, these are some other, just a list of the other resources I use, textbooks, academic journals. Media is a very reliable and informative source that I've used both in the United States and Venezuela. El Nacional is the opposition media in Venezuela, which I grabbed a couple copies while I was down there. And Telesur was an alternative source of media created by ALBA in 2006 as one of the many cultural facets of ALBA, which is not only a political and economic movement, but also a social movement. It has many social aspects. So as far as My research methods go, as I said, an interdisciplinary approach, drawing from these three disciplines. You can't define ALBA, or I would argue a trade agreement, without looking at these three disciplines and lending theories from each. There are subsets within each discipline that I've used, such as within political science, international relations is a little more pertinent to trade policy. Trade policy is a subset of economics that I focused on. And the political and economic history of Latin America and the historical legacies of Latin America's political and economic history, namely being inequality, political, social, and economic inequality, which, I'll have you know, Latin America is still the most unequal region in the world. And it is my opinion that ALBA is in turn trying to address this incredibly strong historical legacy of inequality. These are some examples of my bridging strategies from Veronica Miller and Bachman Silla. Basically, the first is a multi-causal explanation. As I touched on before, what is Bolivarianism? It's something very important. In fact, the name of Venezuela was recently changed to the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, the Bolivarian alternative to the Americas. This is what defines ALBA and the ideology behind it. So it is a political ideology, calling on egalitarian values, as I mentioned, social justice, social inclusion in the political process, which then calls for an economic policy of redistribution of nationally owned wealth, as to address the historical inequality, which Simón Bolívar, as I mentioned, had the vision of an equal, competent region. And next was a compound concept. There are several of these that I go into in my paper. One excellent example is a common market. You would find this term in an economic textbook, traditionally. However, I feel that it cannot just be explained, especially in terms of ALBA, in just an economic perspective. Because what it calls on is, it's an integration scheme, a regional integration scheme, but it's one step short of the European Union as a reference point. You're not adopting the same currency, but you are adopting the same macroeconomic policies, which in turn calls for some coherence of political ideologies as well. Plus, this tends to take place in regions which have shared a common historical background. So, those are my bridging strategies that I use. And in conclusion, my goal, my overall purpose for investigating ALBA, conducting this investigative analysis, is I wanted to find some kind of common ground, and my advisors told me that the best reference point would be to look at NAFTA. Roughly 15 years of a relatively successful free trade agreement. It has raised the standard of living in Mexico. Trade has tripled to $793 billion between the NAFTA partners. However, there are two different approaches between these two different trade alternatives. NAFTA, the free trade agreement, is dealing with an industrialized country and a developing country, the first of its kind in that aspect. And it's augmenting economic growth through capital investment. This picture is a perfect example. Factories, industries, producing manufactured goods, which typically tend to have higher returns on investment. And this is their method of economic growth. And as opposed to that, Latin America is focusing on that historical inequality issue that I've mentioned several times by investing in human capital investment. This is a primary motor of ALBA. This is what drives the auspices of ALBA. And basically, this is an example of, these were all three, actually this man was Brazilian. These are two Venezuelan doctors. They were taught by Cuban doctors that were sent over from Cuba originally in 2004. 28,000 in fact were sent, as I said, in return for below market price oil. And that's just one example of a human capital investment that's taking place through the avenues of an exchange of goods and services that complement strengths and weaknesses of each member country. So in other words, social investment, social capital is what they're focusing on in ALBA, as opposed to capital investment. And I believe that once the playing field can be leveled, once the level of inequality can seriously be addressed, and the labor force, which Latin America has an abundance of, the labor force, once that labor force is skilled, highly skilled and educated, then you can begin manufacturing goods and working on this capital investment. And that is what I believe to be the common ground. Thank you.